Let's put our gospel reading into context today. Jesus' calming of the storm on the sea reveals his power over evil, since the sea represents evil and chaos. The boat on the sea is a symbol of the church and invites us to trust God amid life's turbulence. The Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. When evening had come, Jesus said to the disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Jesus woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The Gospel of the Lord. It was August 24th, 2016. Trey and I had just moved to our new home in Flora, Indiana. Trey was at the lab at Purdue that day, and I was at home unpacking our many, many boxes. Then the sky started getting dark, and the wind picked up. And then the ear-splitting sound of sirens began ricocheting through our small 1-square-mile town. And I began to panic. You see, I grew up in Florida, where you get weeks to prepare for dangerous high-level windstorms. I was not the least prepared that day for a tornado warning, let alone my first week living in the country. So I grabbed my laptop, my phone, some water, and the dog, of course, and we headed downstairs to the basement. The wind picked up even more. I saw a few trash cans fly by our basement window, and then our house began to shudder. My dog Jake began to tremble, and I did too. I tried to look up the radar of the storm on my phone, only to realize that the cell service went out. I had no idea where the path of the storm was headed. I couldn't call Trey, and I felt completely and utterly alone. My dog Jake and I stayed downstairs in the basement, huddled together for what seemed like forever. And then the sirens stopped. And we stayed down there a little while longer, just for good measure, before we came back upstairs and tried to take stock of what had happened. Everything was okay at our house, but later I learned that this particular storm was a part of a system with multiple supercell thunderstorms that produced a total of 7 tornadoes across Indiana that day. The closest one to us touched down just 5 miles from our house. I have never experienced such a terrifying storm. It came up so quickly and unexpectedly, and I felt wholly unprepared for it. I also felt very alone in the midst of it, which made it seem a lot scarier. In our gospel reading for today, it's evening, and Jesus and his disciples are crossing the Sea of Galilee when a great and powerful windstorm comes upon them. Now, the Sea of Galilee is a body of fresh water that sits 680 feet below sea level. It's surrounded by hills, and it is prone to these kind of sudden, violent windstorms that seem to come out of nowhere. We know that the disciples are experienced fishermen, and so I imagine that they try to navigate the storm as best they can until they get to their own point of panic, and in desperation they cry out to Jesus, "Teacher, do you not care that we are drowning?" They don't say, "Teacher, wake up, help us." No, their fear and their panic has already overwhelmed them. They jump to the conclusion that if this is happening and Jesus is still sleeping, the only logical explanation is that Jesus does not care about them. Commentator Debbie Thomas confesses that sometimes she jumps to this same conclusion as well. She writes, "I can't tell you how many times, in how many subtle and not so subtle ways, I have flung this accusation at God. How many times I've linked my suffering to God's apparent lack of care. How many times I've bruised my faith on the assumption that chaos is always and everywhere an unholy aberration, its very existence in my life a proof of God's apathy, God's coldness, God's indifference, and maybe even God's non-existence." Unquote. I have to admit that Debbie's words resonate with me a bit too. During particularly difficult times in my own life, there have been points where, feeling utterly alone, I have thrown my head up to the sky and said to God, "Do something. If you really care, do something. Reassure me that you're there." Maybe there have been times in your own life where you have felt like this too. Perhaps it was during a different terrifying storm or natural disaster. Or perhaps it was in the context of the storms of life that all of us ultimately experience. Broken relationships, grief and loss, unfair circumstances resulting in trauma and pain and confusion and desperation, times when we simply feel overwhelmed. We all have these storms in our lives, and maybe you or someone you love is experiencing a storm like this right now. But the grace and the good news in this story from Mark, the beautiful promise from God at the heart of this gospel passage, is that no matter what storms we face, Jesus is with us in the boat. On our most difficult days, when it feels like God is silent, when we are overwhelmed with the rip current of our human experience, Jesus is with us in the boat. And notice, when Jesus is in the boat, he doesn't say, "You have nothing to fear." On the contrary, there was a lot to fear about that storm on the Sea of Galilee. There was a lot to fear about that tornado. There's a lot to fear in our life today. We continue to navigate this global pandemic. There's intensifying political division, lasting, debilitating effects of slavery and white supremacy woven into the very culture and fabric of our society, a climate crisis, mass shootings on the rise, levels of depression and anxiety and isolation, arguably at higher levels than they have ever been before. There is a lot to fear. And fear is the natural response to things that threaten to overwhelm us and inhibit God's promise of abundant life. Fear is a reality of the human experience, and Jesus recognizes this, which is why I think his words in this passage are so comforting and grace-filled. Jesus doesn't say there's nothing to fear. Instead, Jesus says to his disciples and to us, "Peace, be still. Why are you afraid?" In other words, do not be afraid, not because there is nothing to fear, but because you are not alone. The disciples may have felt abandoned by Jesus, but Jesus was always with them. He was always in their boat. I may have felt alone in that basement, shuddering with Jake, but I was not alone. Jesus was always with me. Jesus was in my boat. And although there are times when each of us feels overwhelmed, like we can't keep our head above the water of the noise and chaos in our lives, Jesus centers us, calms our deepest fears, and proclaims to us that we are never alone. He is always in our boat. Wherever we go, wherever we find ourselves, there is nowhere that we can steer our boat where Jesus is not already with us in it. It reminds me of the words of my favorite psalm, Psalm 139. Part of it goes like this: Lord, you go before me and follow behind me. You lay your hands of blessing upon me. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed underground in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the furthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. Jesus holds us fast. Wherever we are, he is in the boat with us. And having Jesus in our boat doesn't mean the waters will always be calm. In fact, there's a pastor who goes so far as to say, if Jesus is in your boat, expect rough seas. Because if you dare to follow Jesus, this means involving yourself in the struggles of those around you, unquote. But even so, God's peace will be with you. Not a peace that erases all conflict or noise or chaos, but a peace that gives us something to hold on to in the midst of those things, someone to hold on to. And that someone says to us, peace, be still. Do not be afraid, for I am with you in the boat. I am with you in the storm. I am with you always, and I will carry you through the night in this life and in the next. Amen.